this absolutely stellar lineup that we have today. So you all know why we're here, to talk about financialisation. We know the dominance of the financial sector has had a devastating impact on lives and the well-being of people across the world, from land grabs to forcing migrants into precarious jobs. And what we have tonight is a really excellent lineup of speakers who are going to hopefully set out an alternative to us, an alternative to financialisation. So the way we're going to do it is I will introduce our speakers. Each of them will have about 15 minutes for opening remarks, and then we'll have around, hopefully around 30 minutes or so for questions. I'll try and keep our speakers to time. Just before we kick off, I just want to say, this is the last session I'm chairing at Will Transformed, and I just want to recognise that all the really hard work that's been put in by a lot of volunteers. And I know, being privy to some conversations, the planning has been months and months and months in the making. People like Dalia, Gabrielle have been essential to getting sessions like this put on. So, yeah, we all owe them a huge, huge thanks for the work they've put into this amazing, amazing few days. Okay, so before we get to our speakers, I will introduce them all in the order they're going to speak. So firstly, we have Tony Norfield, who is the author of The City, London and the Global Power of Finance. Then we have Yanis Varoufakis, economist, academic and politician. We have, followed by Yanis, is Anne Pettifor, who is an economist and the author of The Case for a Green New Deal, which I believe has just recently come out. The copy here, in case anyone wants to grab themselves one, you know what it looks like. And finally we have Callie Akuno, who's the Executive Director of Corporation Jackson. And so 15 minutes from each speaker, and then we'll throw it over to you guys for questions and comments. But Tony, if you want to take us away the first.
I normally like to walk around when I'm speaking, which is a bit of a risk up here actually, but and I also normally like to have visual accompaniment to what I say. I was promised virtual reality headsets and dancing penguins. Forget about the headsets, the penguins might be along later. Okay, the first image I want to give you, probably the only image I want to give you, is firstly, imagine on this side, what we have is all the world's resources. Human ingenuity, inventiveness, technology, raw materials, everything, right? So this is what the world has to deliver everything we need. What we have over this side is war, oppression, racism, drug and alcohol abuse, complete fucking disasters all over the place. Now, how did that happen? In the middle, what we have is what I call the imperialist grinding machine. What happens is you have the world economy run by a small number of powers. They manage the financial system, the economic system, the commercial and everything else system. And basically, it means inevitably, as long as this machine is in place, all the good stuff we have on this side is going to end up like crap on that side. So the big question you need to have in your head all the time is, if I support a political party or have a political point of view, what is it going to do about this machine in the middle? Is it just going to try and oil the wheels or adjust the dials a little bit, or is it going to try and get rid of it? That brings me to the question of imperialism, which can be quickly defined as how a small number of countries and corporations basically carve up the world and run things. If you're one of the smaller countries in the world, you play no role in anything. Maybe you can be an annoyance, but basically you'll manage to run nothing, essentially. And you have the Americans, the Europeans, the Japanese, and a few other odds and ends of powers around the world will do it. These states run the basic economic system, the financial system and everything on behalf of their corporations. And you find that the major corporations of the world, which you could look at stock market values and you find companies like Apple, Google, Amazon, etc. are the major corporations. What they do, they're not really even financial companies, but they use the financial system in order to buoy up their power. In particular, one of the ways they can do it is by mergers and takeovers. Companies like Google and Microsoft have done more than 200 takeover deals in the past decade or so, which essentially means that they're monopolizing and controlling innovation. So all the gadgets and everything that you'll see are probably in the end run by one of these guys. And this, I think, is a key thing to bear in mind, because it means that rather than the financial system per se being just banks or something like this, no, it's not. It's the way the financial system is used by the big corporations that underlines their power. To give a quick example of monopoly today, I see a number of you are drinking some booze, many of you are using smartphones, and no doubt searching on the internet. Well, more than 90% of internet search is run by Google. 3 companies, Samsung, Huawei, and Apple, control half of the smartphone market, and 5 companies run half the production of beer in the whole wide world. Even a lot of the small branded ones that you'll see are probably owned by Heineken, AB InBev, Carlsberg, Molson Coors, or one of these other companies. So if you're having a drink and searching on the internet on your smartphone, believe it or not, you are at the center of monopoly capitalism today. Okay, let's speak more specifically about financialisation. This is, I think it's a crappy term, frankly, and I never use it. I'm only using it now because I'm on the stage and this is what the topic is. What it misses out is that financial markets are integral to capitalism, not an evil appendage that you can cut out. So we don't have nice, lovely capitalism and nasty, evil finance, right? It's ridiculous to think of it like that. The growth of the financial system, dealing and all the rest of it, is a consequence of what happens with the development of capitalist markets. And it's a consequence of what develops as capital goes international and you get a real development of these markets. All big companies, even if they don't look like financial companies, are very much tied into finance. Not simply the M&A deals I was speaking before, the various takeovers and mergers. You know, anything simple like having to do a foreign exchange deal to do your imports and exports with, or using derivatives to manage against adverse moves in market prices that are going to mess up your business. The key thing about the financial system is the way it sends a signal to everybody, to governments, to companies, and even people watching the TV news, as to what is so-called good and what is so-called bad. And this is what is good or bad according to capitalist markets. Not anything moral. It's, you know, if you try and do something, they'll fuck you up because the stock market will crash, the currency will crash, etc., right? This is the way that capitalist power is expressed, and it's more clearly done through the financial system. You can see I normally rely upon PowerPoint or something like that. Let's look specifically at some of the more UK-related things. the City of London, right? A recent survey by the Bank for International Settlements came out a week or so ago, shows that the City of London is the biggest foreign exchange trading venue in the whole wide world. It's got 43% of the world market. And it's got half the world market in trading financial derivatives. You may think, who gives a damn about financial derivatives, etc., I really don't care. But what you may not know is that although the UK has a huge trade deficit, nearly £140 billion last year, nearly half of that is covered by revenues from the financial system. So the British economy, British imperialism, very much depends upon the financial system. And it's not simply banks, it's also all the legal, accounting, and all the other stuff that goes on, which really goes to show how much Britain is a core part of the global financial system. So can we control finance? I've got 5 minutes. How about that? Basically, if you try and control it, what you find is that you're confronted with the power of capitalist property relations, right? Who owns the world, who runs things, etc. And especially through the state. Unless you are prepared to oppose the capitalist state, not look upon it as something which can be taken over by a friendly Labour government and do a few policies to amend things, then you're going to lose. And that's a lesson that a lot of people have found, including Yanis here in Greece. And capital's power is underpinned by the major countries with economic intimidation, violence, and terror. That's what they do. Banks, as I say, are only one part of the financial system, and the real problem underlying it is the system that they're trying to defend. A couple of quick points on Labour Party politics here, because I'm a lifelong Labour skeptic, at a minimum, and I see that a lot of people are expecting that things would improve quite a bit under Jeremy Corbyn, and yes, it's true, his views are quite different from a lot of other Labour leaders, and that's a step in a better direction. However, look at the 2017 Labour manifesto. Commitment to NATO, raise defence spending to 2% or more of GDP, renew Trident, and it calls the world's, and it's going to back the world's leading defence industry. This world-leading defence industry has been helping the Saudis bomb Yemen, and has bombed quite a few other countries as well in the meantime. And what we get is all the verbiage about human rights and the rule of law is complete verbiage. What happens in reality is that we see support for the power of capital coming through from successive Labour governments. I could give you plenty more details on that. One indication of how things go as well is if you look, let's say, what Israel is doing now to the Palestinians, well, isn't it a bit odd then that dozens of Labour MPs are members of the Labour Friends of Israel, and the shadow foreign secretary is also a member of the Labour Friends of Israel? What is going on there then? Talking more specifically about finance, also in the Labour Party manifesto, we have a hope for a national investment bank, lending especially to small companies, and it says that Britain has a successful international finance industry, but we need a strong, safe and socially useful banking system. In other words, with the offset of giving a bit more credit to small companies, what they want to do is make the financial system, which I've just described as being well, dominating and underpinning the power of the major corporations, make that more socially useful. Well, good luck with that. And that's an absurd, naive faith in the capitalist state run by Labour. We see no threat to British militarism, no threat to the city, no threat to the power of monopolistic corporations. So if you want to see the world transformed, which is the title of this big session here, then I think the transformation has to come through rejecting all of this garbage which I've been talking about before. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We just have one very, very quick shout out, I think, for volunteers in the kitchen.
Hi everyone. This is not on the agenda. It's an emergency announcement. If anyone, you don't have to be a registered volunteer, anyone in this audience would like to help us out in the kitchen this evening, starting now, you can automatically become a volunteer and you will get free entry, yes, free entry to the closing party. I don't know if that's going to tempt anyone, but we'd be very grateful if it did. Thank you.
Okay, up next we have Yanis Varoufakis. So Yanis, 15 minutes, over to you.
Thank you. This feels safer and more friendly. Hello, I can see all of you now. Now, financialisation. Of course, finance, banking, debt are to capitalism that which hell is to Christianity. Unpleasant, but essential. It doesn't work otherwise. But financialisation is a fairly new phenomenon. It started in the 1970s. The dominance of finance didn't start then. It started with the enclosures. The moment the lords chucked out the peasants in order to replace them with sheep, because wool was becoming an internationally tradable commodity, you had a reversal. Under feudalism, you had production first, hard labor, and then you had distribution. The sheriff would take the cut of the baron, of the lord, and finally the lord would sell in local markets the wool, whatever, the carrots, whatever it is that they were producing, I don't know, godforsaken vegetables, and that would bring the lord a certain amount of money that was excess, it was excessive for him, and he would use it in order to lend money to local people and to others. So debt came at the end. So you had production, distribution, debt. With the enclosures, you had a reversal. The moment the lord took an ex-peasant and said, okay, now I'm going to lease this piece of land for you so that you can look after the sheep here and you pay me rent. The ex-peasant had no money to pay the rent. So effectively, the lord would lend the money to the ex-peasant. So debt comes first. And then the ex-peasant will have to produce the wool, sell it in markets, marketization, and then repay, after having paid workers, the landlord the rent, and keep, if he was lucky, whatever was left as a residual, as a profit. So from the beginning, capitalism puts debt, finance first. There's no doubt about that. Then with the second industrial revolution, towards the end of the 19th century, you have the inventions of electromagnetic appliances, from the telegraph to electricity grids and so on and so forth. So you have the networked firm. The first networked firm was not Apple, but it was Edison, it was Marconi, it was the electricity grids. And they needed huge amount of finance. The banks at the time were too small, so they agglomerated, they merged. And what they did, to a very large extent, is they created money from thin air. Banks do not take the savings of Jill to pass it on to Jack as a debt, as a loan. What they do is they just write a number down, put it on the ledger as credit that you have. This is coming out of thin air. And as long as you use it productively and you produce profit, you can pay back the bank with interest, and that effectively drives the machinery of the capitalist accumulation and of consumerism. However, to the extent that this is profitable, the bankers realize that it is as if they have invented an ATM in their living room, and they can actually create money. So if you can create money, why not create loads of it? At some point, effectively what they are doing is they are putting their hand through the time barrier into the future, dragging value that has not been created to bring it to the present, to give it to their corporate friends, hoping that it will be produced. At some point they are doing so much of it that the present can never produce enough value to repay the future, and then you have a massive financial crisis. And then what happens? You pay for it. And then they get bailouts from central banks, from governments, and so on and so forth. This is why, I mean, Ann Pettifor's book, you know, Green New Deal, we have been working on a Green New Deal. The notion of a New Deal comes from Roosevelt, when in 1932, 1933, he had a policy for constraining the bankers, putting the financial genie in a bottle, making banking boring, and at the same time energizing excess savings, the savings of the rich, using public financial instruments in order to create investment into things society needed. Back then it was brown things, it was not green things, but today it should be green things. Effectively, with the war, this New Deal of Roosevelt turned into an international moment when capitalism was quasi-civilized for a very short period of time. It was a new, the Bretton Woods period. The Bretton Woods period was important because while you had oligopoly, you had massive concentration of capital. John Kenneth Galbraith, that excellent American economist, referred to it as a technostructure. He said, this is, you know, don't listen to the liberals talking about, you know, competition and so on. We are run by a technostructure that is fully monopolistic or oligopolistic. They set prices. Actually, Galbraith, during the war, was given the job by Roosevelt to fix prices during the war economy. And once he was asked, isn't that a very difficult job to fix prices? He said, no, it's not difficult at all, because they were already fixed by the conglomerates. So there's no competition, you know, if you think about Google, Facebook, and so on, and not just them, but Volkswagen and Apple and Exxon Mobil, they create markets. Facebook has created a market which is privately owned by Facebook. There's no competition. Either you're in Facebook or you're not in Facebook. Okay? So that was always the case. But it was still production-based. General Motors was producing cars. They had a small finance department for hire purchase purposes. You know, if you didn't have enough money to buy the car, there was a small department. You went there, and they gave you a loan as well to top up your savings so that you'd buy the car. By the 1990s, General Motors was a financial company. They were indulging in the same toxic derivatives that Goldman Sachs was, that made some cars on the side. When I came here yesterday from London, I booked my train ticket using the Trainline app, and I paid 50 pence. That's the fee for the app. Do you know how many times since yesterday that 50p crossed the barriers, the borders of Britain, between Britain and the continent, Britain, Jersey, Britain and the Caribbean? We have calculated it since yesterday, 178 times. Every time going from one account to another, participating in a process whereby all these 50 pences that we pay for, not just that, but all sorts of other things, they create a gigantic river of money, which contributes to the creation, firstly, of tax evasion, and secondly, and far more importantly, a confluence of debt, leverage, and shareholding, that is, private property rights over means of production. That financialization model that I just described is new. The New Deal that I described, which gave rise to the Bretton Woods system and to the taming of finance, it's not an accident that the 1950s and 60s were the only time when capitalism produced stable growth, low inflation, and falling inequality. It was because the Roosevelt program had been expanded beyond the limits, the borders of the United States, and we had a moment when you had something like a mixed economy with the financial sector and the process of financialization being seriously constrained. You could not take money and take it from one country to another. You had to go through various processes and hoops before you took a large amount of money. What is happening today, where we're at the touch of a button, 50p can go 178 times between jurisdictions, was simply unheard of. This is why capitalism resembled, it wasn't, resembled a quasi-stable social economy. But that died in 1971, 15th August it was, when Richard Nixon, President Nixon at the time, blew up the whole system. Why? We're not going to go into this. That system was predicated upon the United States being a creditor nation. They went into a deficit, Vietnam War, social programs and so on. It's a big story as to why. But from that moment onwards, you have the unleashing of the financiers from the shackles of the New Deal. Thatcherism was a repercussion of that and an application of policy that reflected the interests of the newly liberated financiers. Think of what she did with council houses. Effectively, she financialized the working class by giving you a loan to buy your council flat or council house. Effectively, she tied you up to the banking sector. Suddenly, going on a strike was something that you had to think twice. Because what would happen? Would you lose your house? Whereas before, when it was a council house, you couldn't lose it. Suddenly, your pension fund had become a superannuation fund. What pension you would get was predicated upon how the stock exchange went. Suddenly, your pension contributions flowed like a gigantic river into the coffers of gigantic equity and pension funds that then purchased the conglomerates. And you have this absurdity today, whereby, think about it, if you are the CEO of a large company, you live in fear of the pension funds, because with one sale of shares in the company of which you are CEO, the share will go down, your bonus will disappear, maybe you'll be fired. So if you're as a CEO, the only thing you care about, the only thing, you wake up in the morning and you go to bed at night thinking of ways to please the equity funds, the pension funds. But what keeps the pension funds alive? Your contributions, your pension fund. The little people's pension contributions is what keeps the bosses of the bosses alive. And yet, how do the CEOs serve the interests of the bosses? By firing you. Every time they announce the downsizing of the company, firing 10%, the share price goes up. So this is, I mean, the devil could not have thought of a better system, because they're using the working classes' contributions in order to create a system of incentives that effectively sacrifices the working class on the altar of the financiers. So what do we do about it? I'm all for the revolution. I'm all for the revolution. But the problem, comrades, is that we are defeated. The Soviet experience, the authoritarianism of our own comrades. My father was as a communist, was in a concentration camp for communists for 4 years. And he said to me that if our side had won, he would probably be in the same concentration camp with different centuries. Okay? So that's a major defeat that we have not overcome. We can denounce Stalin and so on, but we, the left, we know it in the Labour Party. We know it in Syriza. We know it in all our left-wing parties. We are not very good at combining a program of emancipation and of democracy with a program of converting property rights from private property rights to common property rights. This is what we must do. But before we get around to doing that, we need to stop Boris Johnson, the toxic establishment in Brussels, Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, Donald Trump, because they are all different sides of the same bloody coin. And you know, if Emmanuel Macron were to be smarter than he is, he would have a little portrait of Matteo Salvini and all the fascists next to his bedside, on his bedside, because the reason why he's president is because of those neo-fascists. And the neo-fascists should thank the Austerians, like Merkel, Juncker, Macron, Cameron, because the only reason why the Farages, the Salvins and so on are doing well is because of the austerity cage in which our people have been encased. So, the good people of Britain are downhearted, whether they're Leavers or Remainers. You feel that your politics is completely broken. You feel a certain degree of gloom, whether you're on the one side or the other, because there doesn't seem to be a way out of this dog's Brexit of a process. Well, I have a different perspective. This is a fantastic moment to be alive in Britain today. It is a fantastic moment because all this democratic energy can be harnessed in order to put a progressive socialist agenda back on the table. And you have Jeremy Corbyn, and you have John McDonnell, and you have all the other comrades. We can criticize the manifesto, and I agree with your criticisms of the manifesto. I don't like Trident. I don't like the total constant pandering to Saudi Arabia and all that. But what we need is a Corbyn-led government that is going to put a financial genie in the bottle, that is going to create a Green New Deal by means of a national investment bank that will print masses of state bonds that will be supported by an activist Bank of England to take £1 trillion, £1 trillion over the next 5 years, and put it into work to electrify energy, transport, to create good quality jobs, to start building electric cars in Britain, not diesel cars anymore, and to use the anger of the youngsters and the Extinction Rebellion to harness it, combine it with public finance like Roosevelt did in 1932, and show the rest of the world that Britain can take this moment of Brexit sadness and impulse and turn it into a revolutionary fervor. Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay, Anne, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come down here too, if I may. There are all these people out in the rain. Can we not bring them a little bit closer? But anyway, can you all hear me and see? Great. Fantastic. So I'm really thrilled to be here, and thank you very much to the World Transformed, both for having me here, but also for the fantastic, professional and superb organisation of these events. I'm so impressed. So I want to begin by testing the women. I want to know how many women in this tent read the Financial Times. Put your hands up. 1, 2. Wow, this is good, but it's not enough. It's good, but it's not enough. Why does this matter? This matters for this reason. Last week, there was a little flutter in the Wall Street dovecotes, right? The shadow banking system got itself into big trouble. And how that came about is very technical, we don't want to go into the detail. But if you think of the shadow banking system, it's like a giant pawn shop, right? So what they do is they pawn their assets for cash, right? And what happened last week was they were stuck with all of these assets and nobody wanted to offer cash. Suddenly, cash dried up. Cash suddenly became very expensive. Cost you 7 or 10% to get any cash. When you know that real rates are probably negative. This is a massive amount. You know, if you're messing around with $1 billion, it's big money, it's big potatoes, right? So the old Federal Reserve had to step in, and it had to mobilize $75 billion, which is when I last counted, and I don't know what happened today, so I haven't added that in. $75 billion to provide cash to the shadow banking system. Now, how many people have been following that? 1, 2. This is my problem with the left, right? This is my problem with the left. So I've learned from the chaps, by the way, that you should always show off about your books. So I'm going to tell you this story. Back in 2006, I wrote a little book which the publisher insisted on titling The Coming First World Debt Crisis. I said, look, hang on, guys. I'm not a first world, third world person. I come from Africa. I'm an African. I don't believe in this first world, third world stuff. I don't like it. Secondly, I said, you're calling it the coming first world debt crisis. This is May 2006. By September, when it's published, the crisis will have come and my book will be out of date. No, they said, we have the legal rights over the title. You may just be the author, but tough. This is the title, right? So the book was published and it fell like a lead balloon. How many of you guys read my book? Yeah, I know. Don't tell me. Don't tell me. So they all said, oh, you know, that lefty Anne Pettifor, she's just wishing for this to happen. But it ain't going to happen anyway. To my absolute amazement, it didn't happen in the autumn of 2006. I couldn't believe this massive debt bubble had expanded and it wasn't going to blow up. It just carried on and carried on. And then on the 9th of August 2007, it blew up. And the banks so completely lost confidence in the system, they stopped lending to each other. Right. And the old central bank pumped in more liquidity. This is all Fed, the central bank, the Bank of England was asleep at the wheel. The governor of the Bank of England was watching cricket, so he took a little while. So the point is this, that it took until October 2008 before the public realized what had happened with the collapse of Lehman's. So what happened was, because all of this was happening in the back pages of the Financial Times, and because we weren't reading about that stuff, we all thought, well, the central banks have fixed it. And of course they hadn't. So when the catastrophic failure of Lehman's happened, we all wake up. And what does the left do? The left stands there saying, what just happened? What are we going to do? What happened? We don't, You know, they didn't know what was going on. They didn't understand how the system was working, and so there was no alternative. So what happened, there's this great big vacuum. There was a moment, it was a moment, when the bankers took fright. When they said, yeah, we're culpable, do anything. What do you want to do to us? Please, help us out. I'm going to change my mandate. I'm Goldman Sachs, and I don't have an account with the Federal Reserve, so I don't have access to all that lovely QE, but I'm going to quickly change my mandate in order to get access to public finance, right? And they waited for us to rise up in revolution and rebellion, and we said not a word. Where was the left? It wasn't there, right? And so they leapt in, thought, this is where Naomi Klein's thesis comes in. Let's use this opportunity, this crisis, to make things better for us, right? So today the banks are bigger, better, more powerful, but it's even worse than that. Before 2007, they didn't have taxpayer guarantees. They were actually, in a sense, I had more respect for those guys. They were taking risks in the free market, and they could have made losses. Now, they're backed by governments. They're backed by you taxpayers. 30 million taxpayers in Britain guarantee the banks here, they can't fail, that we won't let them fail again. And 140 million taxpayers in the United States back up the banking system in the United States. So, things are worse than they were then. And the thing about what happened last week is that it wasn't catastrophic. It was probably a sort of technical error. What happened? The Financial Times said, nobody really understands how the cogs in the financial machine work. So they don't know what's going on, really. So these accidents happen. So I don't think that was the beginning of the next crisis. But I think the next crisis is not far away, because what that indicated was the degree of volatility in the system. Are we ready for the next crisis? And what demands are we going to make of the system then? And I just think that's why I really think the left has to get itself educated about the way it works. Now, for a start, I want to say this. I love the Labour Party. I've been in the Labour Party for 100 years. I've slaved away. Oh my God, if I slaved away, I've been attacked and punished by the leadership for being you know, rebellious and all that. But the Labour Party is almost overwhelmingly concerned with social policy. The National Health Service, benefits, all of that stuff, all of that tangible stuff that we do on an everyday basis. We can touch it, we can experience it. The Labour Party doesn't really interest itself in the global stratosphere, which is the financial system. That's for men in pinstripe suits. I'm being rude here, and I don't mean to insult anybody, but it's in effect what we're doing, right? And we've got to change that. So I want to tell you quickly a story which Yanis kindly has referred to in my book, because it's such a powerful story about where we are now. And it's this story. And it's so, I'm quite emotional about it, really. It's about 1919. So I was in Paris this last week. And, you know, 1919 was a really terrible time in Europe. So it's 1919, and the leaders of the world are at Versailles, and they're busy negotiating a ghastly treaty. And it's the 1st of May, and there are strikes. There's a general strike, and there's rioting, and people are dying, and there's uproar, there's upheaval across Europe. And Keynes is in Versailles, and he can see the devastation all around Europe. But he can also see that the world leaders don't care a damn. They really don't care about the people of Germany, they don't care about the people of Europe, they care about their own backs, essentially. And he's really depressed by all this. But he comes up with a plan. And the plan is this. He says, why don't we ask the German people or the German government to issue a bond? Now, I just have to tell you quickly, you know what a bond is. It's a promise to pay. It's the basis of all money. All money begins as credit. All money begins as this social construct, a promise to pay. So he says, why doesn't Germany issue a promise to pay for £1 billion, euros, whatever it was, no, dollars, right? And then we'll get the governments, the allied governments, to guarantee that loan, right? So now you know, when your parents guarantee your loan, you've got a safe pair of hands behind you, and the bank trusts you, and they give you more money than you would have got if you were on your own. When governments, when the French government, the American government, the British government, all back this promise to pay, then it would have been possible for Germany to raise finance at a very low rate of interest, right? He had another plan. He said this bond could become a form of money. And then even ultimately he suggested we should have a system whereby we exchange this money, use this money as our currency, and we have an international clearing union to clear it between countries. It was a brilliant idea. And to his astonishment, the British Treasury said, this is a really good idea. So he took it to the French liked it, and then he showed it to President Wilson of the United States. And Wilson wrote back on the same day and said, nah, the United States can't support this. We can't support this. No, this is too reckless. We believe that it's best for Germany that it should be financed through the usual private channels, i.e. Wall Street. We don't think that it should be guaranteed by governments. We think Wall Street can do this on its own. Now there's a great historian, Eric Rauchway, who's been looking at Wilson's papers. And he's discovered that the letter was written by Thomas Lamont, who at the time was chief executive of JP Morgan. Now, I'll tell you the story for this reason. The difference between a government bond backed up by allied governments and Wall Street providing finance to Germany is the difference between public authority over the financial system and private authority over the financial system, right? And so what effectively happened was the Americans, through Thomas Lamont, said, no, Germany will have to rely on Wall Street and the City of London for its money. The result of that was, of course, Wall Street said you can have money, but this is the price, the very high rate of interest. Secondly, these are the conditions, terms and conditions, right? So we have a period from 1919 to 1939 of debt inflations, debt deflations, massive financial crises, you know, the United States has a collapse in 1921. there's the general strike, and then we lead up to the 29 crisis, and then catastrophic Second World War. And all that could have been prevented if Keynes's plans had been adopted and the German economy had been allowed to recover. So it's just a terrible story, and the reason why it matters is because it's about who controls the financial system, who owns it, who's in charge of it, who's in the driving seat. Is Wall Street in the driving seat in the City of London, or is an elected democratic government in the driving seat? What happened then was private sector, Wall Street was in the driving seat until 1933. And on the night of his inauguration, Roosevelt decides that he's going to end the system of private authority over finance. He's going to dismantle the gold standard. And the gold standard is what we have today. It's a variation. It was globalized finance with the private sector calling the shots.
You have 2 minutes left.
And he said, we're going to dismantle that. He said that on the night of his inauguration. We're going to tell the banks to hand over their gold by Monday, close the banks on Monday, and the government is going to be in the driving seat. Wall Street won't be able to decide whether we spend money to create jobs for employment, and Wall Street won't stop us to invest in dealing with our ecological crisis, the Dust Bowl, right? Furthermore, we will manage the currency, we will manage interest rates, we will manage the major tools in the economy. So we've seen financial system move from control by the private sector, by private authority, to public authority under Roosevelt in 1933 and again in 1945. And then by 1971, they're chipping away at it again. The banks are chipping away against the system. Today, we live under a system where the global financial system is governed by private authorities. So Alan Greenspan says, it matters not who is elected as the next president of the United States. It matters not at all. The world is governed by markets. And we have to understand that. And we have to end the control of markets over our economy. We have to... And we can do it. If Roosevelt could do it in 1933, we can do it too. We can do it by capital controls. We can do it by saying, if you want access to the Bank of England's quantitative easing, backed by 30 million taxpayers, these, comrades, are the terms and conditions of using the Bank of England's resources. That's the very least thing we could do. We could say, if you want to buy government bonds because you don't trust any other kind of asset in the world, because this is the safest asset in the world, these are the terms and conditions for you to have these bonds, which, you know, are faithfully repaid by the British taxpayer every year. And there's a new taxpayer born every day, right? So we can set terms and conditions, but we need the courage and leadership to do that. But if we are to have the courage and leadership, we need the movement to make the demands. And we need the left to understand what's happening in order to make those demands and bring about what I would regard, Tony, as a revolutionary transformation of the system whereby public authority is exercised over the financial system and not private. Thank you very much.
Okay, now our final speaker, over to you.
So, I'm going to do a little walking around, but primarily stay up here. So I'm going to dash right here so the people in the corner can at least see who you're talking to. But the reason why I'm going to stay up here, and I've changed my comments, is I have a little argument with each one of you that I think is worth bringing up in terms of us constructively creating a program to lead us into the future. And so I love the history lessons, but I think there are some warnings I have to give from my positionality upon each of those lessons. So let's start with the New Deal. There are many valuable things, I think many valuable lessons that can be drawn from particularly how Roosevelt employed the state to put some brakes on capital. I wouldn't say he controlled it, he put some brakes on it. But that came with certain social costs for different people inside of the United States, particularly for my ancestors. Because the cost of that wound up being exclusion of black workers from any aspect of the New Deal. And it led to ramifications that still live with us and haunt us to this day. So for instance, my grandmother, who passed not too long ago, spent most of her time, most of her life as a domestic worker. Domestic workers were not covered by the aspects of the New Deal. Farm workers, which most of the men in my family spent coming from the South, were also not included into this deal. And the dimensions of it were framed in the context in which his decisions were made around compromise of not transforming society, but saving capitalism, and doing so at the cost of maintaining social order within the United States. Now, there's a deep lesson that we have to learn about if we're just going to use the levers of the state in this particular way to improve the quality of life that leaves without a deeper interrogation of who the subjects are. If it's not the entire class, if it's not the entirety of humanity, then you wind up serving right-wing arguments which then embolden fascism to come back in different ways. So we have to interrogate this a lot deeper than what has been interrogated. That's one warning I want to put out and have us all be mindful of. The second thing is we've been making an argument that there's some critical things from the 20th century in particular and the social experiments that we have to keep and a lot of things that we got to get rid of. And so a lot of things that we have to learn. So I think we need to recognize that there were some valuable things around the contest of attaining state power that was organized primarily along Leninist lines. Not exclusively, but primarily. You know, from a lot of the revolutions, be it Asia, Africa, etc., Latin America, all of them did a terrible job at promising at delivering on the promise of social transformation. And I think we need to recognize that. But without, what I'm saying in the sense of recognizing that it wasn't so much the capture that I would argue was the problem. The problem is the form of how do you transform. That is the part I agree, to be honest, we haven't figured out quite yet how to do. And so one of the things to link back to what I was asked to speak on in terms of kind of creating an alternative is getting us back into a conversation as the left about centering a practice of the working class becoming a class for itself. Not in itself, but for itself. And we do that through broad democratic practices. There is no other way around that, right? There is no substituting the party for the class. There is no substituting some representational figure for any and each or every one of us. We have to do that through broad democratic means, and all the arguments and struggles and getting tired of each other and being in each other's face and annoying each other that comes with the practice of democracy, which is not smooth, which is not easy, which is often infuriating, but that is what we are signing up to do. And if we don't have the collective patience to deal with each other and all our contradictions, we might as well quit right now. Right? Because that's what it's really going to take. And I don't think there are any shortcuts to that. I really don't think there's any shortcuts to that. So one of the things to talk about our experience in Jackson, you know, we have experimented with a certain level of municipalism, for lack of a term, where we put some folks in office. And then tried to back that with a broad element of People's Democratic Party, power through people's assemblies, and then us trying to use or create vehicles like Cooperation Jackson to then transform the economy. Like every place else on the planet, we've had mixed results at best, right? So we're not in any sense some utopia, but I think there are a lot of critical things to learn from our brief experience. This has been about a 10-year journey of it actually being put into practice. And before that, there was a 10-year preparation plan of kind of thinking out and doing some experiments. So one key lesson is not going to happen overnight, no matter what you do. I've heard, and I repeat it here, I heard someone say on this very stage yesterday that you can have socialism in the UK by December. No, you're not. That's not going to happen. Right? I wish it was that simple, but it's not going to be that easy. Two, that there's broad levels of like democratic engagement in the struggle with each other that you have to undertake to even be able to put out any kind of program or vision. And we have to remind ourselves very critically and deeply, socialism is not just a set of policies and programs. And if we substitute that for the actual ability of us teaching and training and working with each other to really build and exercise power to transform the world, then we're missing the point.
Yeah.
So for us, one of the things that we're trying to make a broad argument in our case is that the practices of the social and solidarity economy are at least a teaching school for how to build the working class capacity to govern society. That is an argument I would bring to all of you. It's not a substitute or something to replace the various forms of other class organizing that exists, trade unions, etc. But it's something that's been, I think, too far divorced from a lot of our practice. And at least I can speak in the United States case, that divorce has happened for a reason. And that too often, if you look at the solidarity economy as it exists in the United States, it's very white, it's very middle class, and it's very removed from any aspect of class struggle other than folks kind of perpetuating their own class privilege. We have to reverse that. Right? And I think we at least can say that we're one of the critical examples of how do you do that working with primarily young people and folks, the vast majority, I would say half of our membership at present are folks who are without homes or homeless people. And there's some critical work that we have to do to be able to move beyond just dealing with people's day-to-day basic needs. So, like right before I came on stage to give you a sense in the story of how real some of the struggle is, there's one of our critical workers who's fighting with us right now to get paid ahead of time so he can have $200 to pay for his room for a week. Right? So that is kind of the reality of which most of us face, I think, in terms of doing this type of day-to-day work and the reality of it, what it basically comes down to. Now, this broader question of talking to a lot of people and trying to figure out, well, I'm coming from the United States, a totally different context. What would be helpful here? Trying to disengage folks. What would be helpful here for the social movement here to kind of engage? And I haven't found one answer, which is kind of a general thing, and I think it may be a helpful thing. But one of the things I think that I do want to impart, I think at least from our particular experience, is digging deeper in terms of identifying who the social subjects are than some of the language that I've heard. And I'm saying that because as I look around the audience, it's also very white and very reflective, I would say not so much of class, but at least a level of education that I think a lot of people I've seen wandering around the streets of Brighton don't have, right? And that's something we need to fix. And I'm not saying that's easy, I'm not saying that in any accusatory way, but it's something we need to fix. And I think we have to figure out when we're here and when we're at these gatherings, there's a level of deep conversation that we have to have with each other, but then we have to find more ways to have conversation with those who are not coming into these conference halls, who are not coming into these spaces. On the occasion of us actually being here, right? To help fortify some of the local union efforts that might be going on here, and to get people into an actual exercise. Like if we're going to bring a couple of thousand people down to Brighton, or I think the other side is Liverpool, if I remember. Manchester, Liverpool area. What if there was like one dedicated day where everybody came together and everybody just went and door knocked to talk to somebody? It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be one agenda or one thing, but just go out, take all those thousands of people and just go out and engage everybody. Particularly going to all the shops with their workers and try to just talk to them about what the conditions are, what are they facing, what do they need, what do they want. So that's just a concrete suggestion. Now the last thing I want to just come back on as kind of a warning that we have. Even though we're advocating the development of the social and solidarity economy as a way of like really building working class consciousness. There's some warnings. And I think Giannis could speak to some of this probably far better than I could. But a couple of things that we have been kind of studying, being students of history ourselves, is the amount of preparation that it takes to be ready for a crisis. That is what we feel that we are doing in Jackson, at least trying to do. And through our strategy, through our planning and organizing, because it's been our particular articulation since Hurricane Katrina, which is really one of the big catalysts for us even creating the Jackson Kush Plan, that was just the beginning of kind of a global crisis around the environment and the crisis and ecocide that was coming. And that we have to start preparing ourselves now with the concrete skills. We say that we make this argument that the skills to transform society are basically the same skills we're going to need to survive Armageddon. Like, that is one of our selling pitches to both ourselves, but also to folks around us, around taking the present seriously, right? And not putting off things to the kind of infinite future, but we need to skill up now. We need to build relations now. We need to learn new practices and new ways of being right now, and not put that off into like some distant future, which may or may not come. So that's a critical thing. But one of the things in terms of why we say we need to do this preparation now is because when we look at the broad, I would cite two, we look at the broad experiences of when the social and solidarity economies kind of occupied the fore, at least of left discussion. It was Argentina after 2001, and then during the crisis in Greece, I would say from 2009 until about 2015, at least my recognition of what folks have shared with me. And both of those have come like on the heels of profound financial crisis, when folks were kind of left with no alternative but to turn to certain aspects of solidarity. But when things begin to kind of re-normalize, all of those practices disappear. There's something that we have to learn about that, because I would argue that because the prep work wasn't done, it just became a way of mutual aid in and of itself, but nothing more transformative. That's a shortcut, that's a fault that I think we have to do by building these practices up now and using them as a means for us to learn how to govern society and control the means of production. I'll stop there.